So this is Research Methods, Unit 5, Part 1, on non-experimental research. So when we talk about experimental and non-experimental research, we're going back to that distinction that I spoke about earlier, where the difference between these two types or classes of research is that one involves randomization and one does not. In experimental research, what you always have is randomization, by which I mean you have a group of people, or if not people, rats or mice or whatever it is that your subject is, and you randomly assign these entities into conditions. You do that using a coin or a random number table, but basically what happens is that you end up having two groups which were whose membership was determined randomly, and so you can argue that it's likely that those two groups are equivalent in many ways. Another way of talking about experimental research is that it's typically done in a laboratory, although not always, but usually in a constrained situation. So you might do an experiment in a classroom or in a soccer field or something like that, but usually it's a constrained situation. And in experiments, there's typically an experimenter, with the person who's running the experiment, and the experimentee, who we also call the participant. And that's a relationship that is almost always present in true experiments. Now, in non experimental research, what you have is that randomization is typically impossible. And it's impossible because the very nature of what you're studying defies your ability to be able to randomly assign people into groups. So, for instance, where it may be possible to assign people into one group where people get some kind of educational intervention where they're trained on something, and another group does not get that intervention, there are certain things that you want to study that you're not able to randomize. For instance, you might be interested in gender differences. Now, you can't assign someone to be either male or female. You can't assign people to be of one ethnic group or another if you're interested in ethnicity. So in this case, there's a lot of things that you can't study in an experimental way because they do not permit you to randomize. Non-experimental research also typically occurs in a natural context. So usually this is research that occurs not in a laboratory, but outside the lab, dealing with people who are in their natural situation, whether it be at work, whether it be at school, it could be, people who are on vacation, but generally speaking, this is happening in a natural context, not generally in a lab. And often with non-experimental research, there's no experimenter present. So, for instance, in some of the research that I'll talk about later on, it's not actual people that are being studied, but it's the number of accidents that are on highways in America. And you can get out certain psychological principles by looking at this kind of data where there really isn't an experimenter present, and to some extent there's not a participant present. Although, of course, there was someone who was in a car, at some point, but what you're not doing is actually testing people in this kind of research. So when we talk about correlational research, we're talking about non-experimental research interested in the relationship between two or possibly more values. Now, typically, the values that are used in correlational research are continuous. That's the most common thing because it's useful to look at continuous variables because they allow you the greatest amount of ways of analyzing them. So, for instance, when we were talking about the relationship between temperature and ice cream sales, or temperature and the crime rate, those are continuous variables because they vary on a continuum. But that's not always the case. So, imagine that if you were interested in people who work for an airline that are flying versus those that don't fly, so ground crew versus the people who work on the airplane. That's not a continuous variable because you either are in one or the other group. Or if you're studying something on the effects of having had cancer on behavior, people are either they have cancer or they have not had cancer. There's no some person who had half cancer or quarter cancer. It's either you had cancer or not. In other variables, it is also the case that you can't have continuous. You have to deal with dichotomous variables such as gender or ethnicity, where it's not the case that you are 1/4 male and 3/4 female, but most of the time either one or the other. So correlational research, just because it uses the word correlation, which we're used to in statistics as referring to a statistical technique for examining the relationship between continuous variables, it's not the case that in correlational research that they need to be continuous. It can be dichotomous variables. So there are 4 ways of acquiring data when you're doing correlational research. We're going to talk about 3 of them in this section, and then we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about a 4th one in the next section. But the 3 that we're going to talk about this time are observational research, archival research, and case studies. These are some of the ways in which people do non-experimental research. Now, I just want to mention for now the other way of doing it, which is survey research. But that requires its own section because there's a lot more to say about survey than there is to say about any of these other types of research. So with observational research, what we have are several different kinds. One is naturalistic observation. And within that context, we have 2 subcategories: unobtrusive research and non-reactive research. So unobtrusive research is research that you're doing that the people who you're studying don't even know that you're studying them. In that sense, it's unobtrusive. So there have been studies that have been done that have looked at people, their behavior at food courts in malls, or on highways, or on pedestrian intersections, things like that, where the person who's observing is just standing there with a clipboard recording whatever it is that they are interested in studying, but that they're not interacting with the subject. And that's one way of doing this kind of research. Another is non-reactive research, which is very similar, where you're not getting a reaction from participants. So you may be studying them in a natural context, but you're not looking at your own interaction with them, and it's called non-reactive. Another kind has to do with physical trace research. Now, trace research has to do with the fact that human behavior often leaves behind evidence that there was a person that was doing something in a particular context. So just like there's footprints in the sand on the beach in the morning can tell you that there was a person walking there at some point previously, there are traces that are left in various places and spaces that allow you to analyze and make interpretations about the people who interacted with that space or place. So, for instance, one might be interested in whether or not people were, doing a diary in terms of when you ask people to to write a diary. Whether or not it's the case that how far they got based on the number of fingerprints that were left on a page, or one might look at in a library comparing different genres of books with the number of times that the book has been checked out based on the stamps that appear in the card that goes in the back of the book. That might be a little bit out of date because in today's, at least at the libraries that I've been to, they no longer use those cards. But back in college, I remember going to the library and we were able to look and see when was the last time someone checked out the book that you were looking at. Sometimes it was the 1930s or 1940s, but was the last time that this book was actually checked out of the library, which is an example of physical trace research. Now, another brand is structured observational research in the laboratory. There's a variety of such measures where you do a particular kind of setup in a laboratory and you see how people behave. A very common example of this is called the strange situation, which is used with children. And with the strange situation, what happens is that a mother and their, say, 2-year-old enter a room, and there's a stranger in the room. And the mother then, after 2 minutes, gets up and leaves the room and shuts the door. And the question is what does the child do in relation to the mother leaving and the stranger that's in the room? And then the mother, after 2 minutes, comes back into the room. And another measure is what happens with the child when the mother returns. And I don't need to get into details here, but some children don't really care that their mother left. Other kids go crazy and they start pounding the door. And when their mother comes back in the room, they start punching the mother, almost to punish her for leaving. And then other children, that don't care that the mother leaves, sometimes go over and actually play with the stranger. So this was an experiment that was set up in the 1950s by a woman named Mary Ainsworth, and it's been used many, many times to study the nature of the attachment relationship between parents and their children. And that's been a very large literature, and it's an example of a structured observational research that occurs in the laboratory. Again, because there's no randomization, children aren't being randomized in the conditions. They're just being observed when they come into a laboratory. And it's a good example of one where even some research which is done in the laboratory is correlational. Another brand is participant observation. While this is not common in psychology, this is common in other fields such as anthropology. And the idea here is that a person will go and live in a community and learn all there is to know about being a member of that community. So one might move to a small temple town in India and live among the monks that live there and participate in the ceremonies and ultimately learn a great deal and write a great deal about the nature of the interactions among the people who are part of the sacred community and the broader community or economic exchanges that occur. Whatever it is an example of what's called participant observation. Now, what I wanted to give you is an example of an observational study, and I'm having you read this study as part of this unit's lesson. And so what this study had to do with, this has to do with personal space in bathrooms, public bathrooms. And the idea is this, is that there was a researcher that was interested in whether or not, there is a relationship between where people stand and, at a urinal in a men's room, and whether or not another person who comes into the room would either stand next to a person or stand further away. And so what this person did is hid in a bathroom stall and looked at the urinals and basically recorded over the course of several days or weeks, when any person came in, where if a second person came in, where that person would stand in relationship to the first person. Now, this sounds kind of corny or silly research, but in reality, understanding things about the nature of personal space is an important thing for psychology because it ends up being a very important issue with regard to people's behavior. And that's an example of, an observational study that you'll read about. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages of observational research. One advantage is that it allows you to study real-world behaviors in real-world situations. Now, a disadvantage, though, of that is that often the study of real-world behaviors in real-world situations tells you little about the underlying mental processes involved in their instantiation. So let me go back to the urinal study. Now, it may be true that in the context of a bathroom, if person goes to urinal 1 and a second person comes in, they're unlikely to go to urinal 2, but far more likely to go to urinal 3 or 4. Is that the same as what happens when someone might walk into a bar? Maybe if it's the case that you want to sit and have a conversation with someone, you're not going to sit way down at the other end of the bar. You're going to likely sit next to another person so that you're in order to communicate. Likewise, it may be the case that, if two friends go into the bathroom, maybe they're more likely to stand closer together than further apart. So in reality, even though it was a well-known study, more because it was about urinals than anything, the question is whether or not the behavior that occurs in bathrooms generalizes to other situations that don't involve standing next to someone while they're going to the bathroom. An advantage of observational research is that it's often cheap and easy. It's not expensive to sit in the bathroom and peer through a crack in the door at people standing at you. It's a little creepy, it's a little weird, and it's not something that I think that I would volunteer to do, but it doesn't cost anything. So you could probably get an army of research assistants to sit in bathrooms throughout campus and do this kind of observational research. So that's a good advantage, is that it's cheap and easy. But the problem is that often cheap and easy research isn't extremely interesting. So I would argue that in the case of the urinal study, it doesn't require someone to do an actual study where they sit in a bathroom and observe behaviors to know that there's this tendency for people to not want to stand next to a stranger at a urinal in a bathroom that has multiple urinals. You could ask any man who's, has any length of time experiencing bathrooms if this is true, and they would say yes. So in some sense, it's almost like you didn't really need to do the study to begin with. It was already, the answer was kind of already known before the study was actually even done. Now, another advantage is that there's potential for multidisciplinary conversation. So, the kind of research that's easily observed in public settings is something that other disciplines might be interested in. So, for instance, sociologists or anthropologists might be interested in the results of a study on personal space. However, it's often the case that in academia, multidisciplinary kind of conversation doesn't really occur. And this has to do with lots of reasons. There's different paradigms that different fields use. There's different assumptions that different academic disciplines employ. So it's often the case that there's not that much conversation between different disciplines about a particular phenomena, which is unfortunate, but it's just the case of the way in which academia tends to work. Now, we're going to talk a bit about archival research. Archival research is a little bit different than the observational research that we've been talking about because archival research requires going back and finding historical documents that you use in order to make claims or arguments about a phenomena. So, when one does archival research, what typically occurs is that you find existing records to explore relationships among variables. Now, those existing records could be published reports. There's a particular way of doing psychology called meta-analysis, where you summarize the report of multiple studies and you use the data that are in those studies to make a broader claim than what the original authors were using, and that's called meta-analysis. But also, one can go into government statistics. This is particularly useful because one of the functions of governments is to take statistics on many things. Because in order to run an effective government, you need to know lots of facts about the way in which the world is orchestrated. So, therefore, if you go to the government, the particularly U.S. government, you can find troves of data sets and troves of statistics about anything ranging from the per capita consumption of milk per state to the expenditures on combating Lyme disease per county in the United States. The government has statistics on everything, and you can make claims based on that. Also, some people go back to newspapers to look at newspaper accounts of particular phenomena that have gone on, and that's another way in which people have been able to get at some of the phenomena that historically are interesting. One that I'm going to have you read about has to do with 9/11. Now, of course, 9/11 occurred in 2001. That's now quite a long time ago. But and many of you who are students that are college age probably don't remember this very well because it happened at a time in which you were very, very young. But I was there, as were people that were a little bit older. And one thing that you found is that after the 4 planes were crashed, there is a great fear of traveling on an airplane. People were afraid to get on the planes because, you know, the security apparatus to prevent it from happening again had not fully been set up. So they're using the same old scanners, the same people scanning the luggage and everything, and so people were afraid to get into planes. However, what happened is that because people were afraid to fly, they instead drove. And what you saw after 9/11 was an increase in the number of people who were driving, and consequently an increase in the number of traffic accidents that occurred on highways. And what the paper that you're going to read explores is the fact that in all, more people died in highway accidents due to the increase number of people on the highways than passengers who died on the 4 planes that crashed as part of 9/11. And it's a very interesting use of archival data in order to make an argument about a phenomenon. Now, some of the advantages of archival research is that it allows you to explore real data on topics that would be difficult to explore experimentally. So, we can't reproduce an event like 9/11 in order to see its impact before and after the event on psychology. Events just happen. And so archival research allows us to have a window into how real world events affect behavior and action. So there are a lot of things out there like that that we just can't manipulate experimentally. And it's useful to go back in the historical record to get insight into what behavior was like before and after a major event. But unfortunately, such data is often not conducive to understanding underlying processes. We don't have any data before 9/11 about people's fear of flying relative to afterwards because, of course, no one saw that coming. And so it's hard to get at underlying reasons why people might behave in a particular way. There could be alternative explanations as to why people drove more after 9/11 that didn't have to do with fear but had to do with convenience or something else. So therefore, that's one thing that can come up as a disadvantage, is that it's hard to get at underlying processes. An advantage is that it's quick, easy, and cheap. It's really not difficult to go to a website that the government maintains and acquire some data on a particular phenomenon that you're interested in studying. It's certainly a lot quicker than running an experiment on people. However, a disadvantage is that you rarely have any control over how the data was collected. So it's difficult to rule out alternative hypotheses. So one thing that people who do archival research are often faced with is the fact that the way that things are calculated changes over time. So, for instance, in different census, the U.S. Census that they put out where they count the number of U.S. citizens, they've counted different ethnic groups in different ways. And that has resulted in some confusing results that have more to do with the way in which categories change than demographic changes. And so it's difficult to, unless you know a lot of the details how the data was collected, to rule out alternative hypotheses. Now, a case study is a single examination of a particular individual group or context. And so a case study is something which is rather rare in the field of psychology, but it's sometimes useful when you find a particular individual that is exhibiting a remarkably unusual phenomenon. So, for instance, one example might be hysteria. Back in the late 1900s, the psychologist or psychiatrist Freud observed that women were behaving in a way that was very unusual, that they were experiencing symptoms that didn't seem to have a physiological basis. And so he diagnosed them with a illness called hysteria, which is, this is something that's going back into the history of science. It has to do with the uterus, which, if you ever heard of the term hysterectomy, that's the removal of the uterus. But hysteria means that the uterus was in the wrong place. Now, there's no evidence that this is true, and hysteria is a diagnosis that has, no one's any longer diagnosed with. But It's a good example of a case study. Vygotsky's work on mental calculators. There's a Russian psychologist, Lev Vygotsky, that studied people that were really good at doing math. And so his case studies were really important in figuring out, like, how is it that people who can do these remarkable calculations, how are they able to do it? And finally, some work that I spoke about before, Festinger's work on the UFO cult, where he joined a UFO cult in order to gather data on how they behave. And it gave insight into the process of cognitive dissonance. So that's a good example of a case study. But probably one of the most famous ones is that of Paul Broca, who was a French neurologist, and he's famous for identifying an area of the brain that you probably will remember from intro to psych called Broca's area. And this area is the part of the brain that is used in producing speech. So it's common that people actually have a stroke or a blood clot in the area of the brain that is where Broca's area is, and it results in them not being able to speak. So there was a particular famous case that Broca did, where he found a patient that was named, we don't know his actual name, but we call him Tam, because the only word that he could say is Tam. And so Broca would ask him a question like, how are you today? And this guy would say, Tam, 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 Tam. And he just couldn't produce language, even though he could comprehend language. So if he was asked to put a book on a shelf, he could do that. But he wasn't able to respond in any way verbally. Well, after some time, he died, and Broca took out his brain, and you can see in this image that I have at the bottom of the screen, on the top of the screen you have a normal brain, and at the bottom of the screen, can you see how there's an area of the brain that looks like it's not there? It's right by where, on the top half of the screen, you see the word temporal lobe. Look at that same location in the brain at the bottom, and you can see that that area seems missing. Well, that's the area where he had the stroke that made that area, because of lack of oxygen, die. And that's the reason why he couldn't speak, is because that area was damaged. And it's an example of the first time that we knew that the brain has different functions for different regions. And so it's a very important study in the history of psychology. So an advantage of case studies is that you can gather a wealth of information regarding individual instances of a phenomenon. So you know a whole lot about this man Tam or about a mental calculator. You can gather a lot of data on a single person. But a disadvantage is that do the findings extend beyond the cases themselves? Maybe for this person that Broca studied, that is where language was, stored in his brain. But if you looked at someone else's brain, it would be an entirely different region. Now, it turns out that that's not true, that most brains have a Broca's region like in that same exact area. So it's not the case that that's true, but if you only went by one example, it would be hard to determine whether or not that could be true or false. So an advantage of case studies are depth. You can really get a lot of information from a single case. But typically, you have an observer that's biased. So it's very hard to, do a case study on, for instance, as Freud did on women that had hysteria, if there is a bias that the person who's studying them had about the nature of how women's psychology occurs. So if you go into a situation in which you have a preconceived notion about the way in which people behave like women, and that's based on a biased belief, as many beliefs in the 19th century were, one could come up with a false result that, the reason why these women were experiencing the symptoms that they did had to do with some questionable relationship that they had with their opposite sex parental figure, which is something that was common in Freud's writing. Um, Typically, in these days, we don't really rely upon that kind of, case study to make generalizations, but it's useful as a guide that points to potential future directions for research. Finally, case studies are interesting to read. Normally, um, you find out a lot about a particular individual, and usually the phenomenon that they're studying is so unusual that it ends up being very interesting to learn about the diversity of how human psychological functioning occurs. However, a disadvantage is that they're time consuming to conduct, that giving an individual an extensive battery of tests or waiting for an individual to pass away so you can look at their brain, that takes time. And so with case studies, one of the limitations is that they're often time consuming. Now finally, I just want to go on some recording methods. Now, this is, some common ones that have been used. There's field notes where if you're doing ethnography, often it's the case that people who do that kind of work have diaries extensively that they take notes in, and that's one way. Similarly, when you're doing observational research and you're sitting in a bathroom stall, you'll have a clipboard, and basically that's a short version of field note. Another way of doing recording with historical data, archival data, is content analysis, where you might have categories that you might make counts of. For instance, the number of times that in a New York Times paper is a story mentioned that is primarily about a prominent woman versus a prominent male, to look at biases that have historically occurred in representations of women and men. Hermeneutics is a kind of approach that's rare in psychology, but that's more of an interpretive process. Because very few, it goes sort of at the edge of what research is. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but you'll read about it in the book. But one of the most important things with doing recording methods with non-experimental research is to have a good procedure that you set out from the onset in order to be able to, assure yourself that you're not biasing your results by having preconceived notions, that you're recording things as accurately and precisely as possible, and that the standards that you're setting will avoid any problems possibly with reliability and validity, and that you exert the greatest control as possible.